thank you for that lovely introduction, Matt. And I have to say, Matthew, I have to say that my mum did say to me, Reina, only you. I haven't been into Debenhams yet to see that range. And my mum did say to me at one point, Reina, only you could have found a research project that meant you had to go shopping. And I said, oh yes, but Mum, it was you taking me shopping when I was a girl who trained me in how to shop. So experiential learning. I'm delighted to be here. I'd like to thank Sophie and the team for making me so very welcome. Today, I'm going to focus on issues of choice and politics in relation to Muslim modest dress and modest fashion. Now, I often get asked how I came to be interested in this topic, and especially because I'm not myself Muslim. And so I'm going to start with a rapid resume of how I came to be doing this work. And I'm conscious of time, but if I get too racy, somebody just tell me to slow down.
Back onto a train track.
Oh, okay, fine. I'll be talking in more detail about particular case studies later, but I'm going to start by sketching in the political context for discussions about dress choice and religion. I want also to indicate my particular methodological mix, because I think this might be helpful for when we come to talk about your research projects afterwards. So I'm hoping we'll have time for discussion. Next slide, please. Some of you may know, and Matthew's already alluded to, that I started in fine art, art history, English, and cultural history. So my previous work focused on Western imperial cultures and Orientalism in the fine arts and literature. I researched how Western gendered identities were racialized and how religious and religio-ethnic identities were mobilized by elite Ottoman writers in a bid for social emancipation that simultaneously challenged Western stereotypes. In other words, I wrote about dead authors and their books, and dead artists and their paintings, all of it concerned with Orientalism, gender, cultural power, and imperialism in the formation of multiple modernities in the 19th and early 20th centuries, especially in the Middle East. So how come contemporary material, and why fashion? Well, after 9/11, and again after the London bombs in 2005, I found that the media was full of images of Muslim women that seemed to reproduce so many of the Orientalist stereotypes that I'd been studying in elite and middle-brow cultural forms of the past 2 centuries. Whilst the securitizing discourse was picturing Islam and Muslims as outside of so-called Western civilization, I could see that the streets were full of cool young Muslim women styling hijab, the headscarf, from the British high street. But these style creations were conspicuously absent from celebrations of British street style. This absence mattered because many young Muslim women were specifically using fashion to communicate to external observers that they were part of British society. I don't think that consumer culture will bring about world peace, but I do know that people from the majority culture often can't imagine how hurtful and alienating it is to feel disregarded by the prevalent cultural forms of the society in which you live. And consumer culture is one of the predominant cultural forms today. Now, I want to pause here and talk briefly about terminology. Modest fashion has emerged as a commercial term, an ideological concept, and a category of critical analysis. For some who participate in modest fashion, the term has also signals a style of dressing, an attitude to covering and displaying the body. But although some religious adherents from different faiths would each argue that for their faith there are particular ways of achieving modesty, few would think that it denotes a specific aesthetic. In contrast, the variety of ways in which modest presentation has been achieved in the past and in the highly varied commercial niche market for modest fashion today reveal the variety and creativity with which modest fashion is achieved around the world and across the faiths. These developments in modes and styles of modest dress are rarely without controversy. In-group and out-group attempts at surveillance, regulation, and control are a constant feature of how women and men plan, discuss, and experience their modest self-presentation. For researchers, for students, defining our terms is always a key issue. On one hand, it's hardly surprising that my work on practices of modest dressing tracks and analyses the emergence of the term within the market and its deployment and contestation in fashion mediation, especially online blogs and social media, although, as Matthew was saying, I've also looked at print magazines. As a cultural historian, my approach to contemporary dress practices reaches back 2 centuries. But the historian's instinct to precision in terminology comes up against the changing contemporary significance of the words that one might use to designate particular garments or dress practices. And I want to talk you through some of this as it bears directly on the politics of defending choice. When asked to talk about modest fashion, I often begin by reminding listeners that women have been dressing fashionably with different definitions of modesty in mind for centuries. Often the same garment has been worn by women of different religions, and in the case, for example, of forms of veiling that covered the face in the Middle East, often signaled social status rather than personal piety. In my own research on the Middle East and on Euro-American imperial cultures and Orientalism, I had generally in earlier works referred to forms of veiling and unveiling and used this term to encompass diverse modes of head, face and body covering seen in the late Ottoman Empire. When I started writing about contemporary Muslim fashion in the early 2000s, I used the term veil to refer generically to the then more prevalent practice of head covering in Western Europe and North America and other Muslim minority contexts like Australia. At that time, face covering could be distinguished by referring colloquially to face veils or to niqabs, or more rarely burqas. But as legislation in France and court cases in Britain from the mid-2000s began to focus on face covering, the term shifted again, with British English language usage increasingly understanding veil to refer to face covering rather than head covering. So the rapid changes in title within my own research practice and publications and public engagement repeatedly reminds me that terminology in relation to modest dress is inherently unstable and frequently controversial. Particular garments have different names. Names for garments change. And the ideological significance of how things are named is itself highly charged and also changeable. I've had cause several times to reflect on the politics of terminology in my own work. As veiling shifted in British English from head covering to face covering, I stopped referring to the veil and began to use the term hijab as a generalized category to the diverse forms of head covering I could see about me. It was also the term that was appearing in a lot of social media, hijabi fashion bloggers, for example. In this, I was following the popular use of the term in Muslim modest fashion blogs and social media, and amongst the young women that I interviewed for my book, Muslim Fashion, and I started the research on that in 2005. Next one, please. But the near-hegemonic status of this term in Anglophone discourse about Muslim dress is challenged by Asra Nomani and Hala Arafa in the Washington Post, who, tracing the etymology of the word from the Quran and the Hadith, argue that it never meant simply headscarf. Emptying the term of its apparent neutrality, they position the term hijab as a descriptor that has been mobilized by repressive forms of Islam in Saudi Arabia and Iran, which seek to promote head covering, they say, as a virtual sixth pillar of Islam, in order to normatize it as a required practice for Muslim women. They argue that discursively this repositions as immoral or immodest the women who do not cover their heads, with attendant judgment and sanctions. Advocating that hijab be avoided in media terminology, they propose that feminists should join in supporting Muslim women in pursuit of the right to cover or not cover, and for full participation in religious spaces, practice, and politics. Many feminists, Muslim and non-Muslim, do indeed take this approach, but it may be that in framing the argument about choice in religio-cultural expression through the language of hijab serves unwittingly to promulgate a worldview that is not gender inclusive or egalitarian. Now, that many of the young women speaking to me of their hijab fashions would not themselves be aware of this argument about terminology is precisely the point. It's a timely reminder that the academic researcher is herself part of the discursive construction of values and judgments. Terms that seem or seemed to be preferable for their ability to be inclusive or non-judgmental may take on new valences in new circumstances or when used with different audiences. And of course, there are so many parallels here with my work on lesbian, gay, queer, LGBTQ, the alphabet soup of abbreviations and terminologies, where those terms are also shifting and highly contested. Next slide, please. The commercial manufacture and distribution of modest fashion in the late 20th and early 21st century brought a new set of associations to the term modest fashion as a composite term. Following the popularization of this category online in commerce and commentary from the mid-2000s, I've used modest fashion as a catch-all classification to describe the many different ways in which women dress in relation to concepts of modest body management and behavior. Some of the early designers and creative entrepreneurs from the mid-2000s used the label modest because it wasn't attached to a specific religious community. And obviously, they were very keen to get customers from other religious backgrounds. And also, as well as the business case from that, many of them were ideologically committed to supporting other women in their practices of modest dressing. However, the intended inclusivity of the phrase modest fashion didn't always translate well in the wider fashion industry. So designers who wanted their clothes to be taken up by buyers for mainstream department stores, for example, before our recent Debenhams example, would say to me that modest was the kiss of death when they were talking to buyers. You know, no one wanted. Muslim was a huge kiss of death. Modest was also the kiss of death. And this is something that designers from other religious backgrounds said as well. Also, some people, some women who participate in what some like to call a modest fashion movement don't like the term modest because it can have associations of self-abnegation. And that's at odds with their feminist principles and practice. So it's not a neutral term. Now, we know the market is not neutral. The growth of a market producing modest fashion has a social impact, legitimating practices that may previously have been seen as minority or extreme, and that may still be regarded this way by some. The market doesn't operate outside of society. It actively shapes a society in which individuals and groups live and is shaped by them in turn. While some religiously identified people argue that modest dressing should not be commercialized and that fashion, with its inference of wasteful, unnecessary consumption, is inappropriate for modest social values, for many others, the availability of fashionable garments and accessories has assisted in the practice of modest dressing. The availability of a market for forms of modest apparel may be a boon to some, a pressure to others. But consistent across all the modest dressers I've spoken to is a consciousness that their forms of self-presentation are open to surveillance and regulation from within and without their religious communities. Internal to religious communities, women who participate in modest dressing may find themselves challenged by conservative women or men who disparage them for covering the wrong way or using immodest bright colours or patterns. External to religious communities, different forms of modest wear become a focus for legal control, harassment, and discrimination. For many modest dressers of all faiths, and at the core of what some see as a cross-faith modest fashion movement, there is an emphasis on women's choice, hence the timely reminder from Namani and Arafa to encompass all choices. For many women, forms of modest dress are inauthentic if they're not freely chosen. An ideal of respect for women's individual choices is widespread, even when it is difficult to maintain. For Muslim women, it's perfectly clear in Muslim minority settings in Europe, North and South America, or Australia, that there is indeed a cohort of young and youngish women who are in a position to choose to wear hijab or other forms of modest dress. But it's also clear that there are many women who exercise little choice in when, how, or whether to cover their heads, faces, bodies. Whatever the individual reasons and social context, behind particular forms of Muslim dressed embodiment, the observer can't tell if a mode of dressing is freely chosen. Neither can the observer tell what was intended. Muslim dress, Muslim fashion, like all dress and fashion, is polyvalent, generating different meanings to different observers and rarely, if ever, communicating directly the intention of the wearer. I always like to say I might go into work thinking I look incredibly cool, and my students are looking at me thinking, what is she doing? For Muslims, don't comment, by the way. For Muslims, for people of other faiths, as for everyone, choice is always contingent and constrained. Modest dressing, like all clothing, can be understood as a form of embodiment that is spatially and temporally contingent and changeable. Although broadly accepted as approach within fashion studies, especially within the sociology of fashion, it's worth emphasizing spatiality in relation to modest fashion. The inclusion of religion into the frame of fashion can often lead non-specialist observers to exceptionalize the modestly dressed body, regarding the body dressed in relation to religion as somehow intrinsically outside the vagaries of the fashion industry, and see it as emblematic of unchanging, ahistorical, collective religious or religio-ethnic identities, rather than as part of the modern world marked by fashion as change and bound up in processes of individuation. The commitment to understanding modest dressing as something that is mutable, individuated, and liable to change over the course of an individual lifetime is a cornerstone of my research approach. And this is informed by sociological approaches to everyday religion. Work by scholars, I'm sure you'll know, such as Ammerman, Maguire, and others, not specifically on fashion, is invaluable to the researcher of modest fashion because it emphasizes that daily religious practices are syncretic and are often developed through interaction with rather than rejection of the market. Now, I find this framework helpful even when considering instances of modest dress that position themselves against the quotidian and commercial concerns of the fashion industry. I think here of the anti-fashion ethos discussed in Saba Mahmood's influential study of Egyptian women in the early piety movements of the Islamic revival in the mid-20th century, where her emphasis on the materiality of dress processes makes clear that the repeating act of putting on the hijab, putting on the veil and modest dress, was integral to the cultivation and maintenance of a pious disposition. Now, my research to date has focused on a cohort of modest dressers who were able to choose when and how to take up hijab. As studies by Emma Tarlow and others have shown, this segment is firmly committed to the protection of women's choice, to cover or not cover. Specifically in relation to my focus on commercial cultures, these young women use the global trends of mainstream fashion to create style distinction from their elders and to forge links with their peers. Next one, please. Modest fashion emerged simultaneously across other faiths, developing online as commerce and commentary, with a women-led niche market supported by a lively blogosphere and print media. And here I want to signal that I think it's politically important to de-exceptionalize Muslims, especially young Muslims, taking religiously related or ethno-religious experience out of the singularity of the securitizing framework and pointing out instead how much young Muslims share with their peers in other religious communities. Interest in modest dressing as fashion is common among young and youngish women of several religious backgrounds, most notably in the other Abrahamic faiths, but also evident amongst young Sikhs, for example, as well as women who identify as secular or who don't identify in religious terms. And this would include also, of course, the growing demographic of people who in surveys check the spiritual, not religious category. And this, as Nancy Ammerman has argued, is a category, a descriptor that might best be understood, as she says, more a moral and political category than an empirical one. In other words, it moves us away from a presumed binary between spirituality and organized religion. I've discussed elsewhere the value of modest fashion as a category in the market. Today I want to concentrate on how cross-faith interaction and commerce impacts on discourses of choice. Young Muslims are also typical of their generation because they've grown up with consumer culture and don't necessarily see it as antithetical to religious expression or values. Accustomed to the pleasures of world music, world food, world culture, they feel free to draw on a pan-Islamic mood board for inspiration. So the young women that I was speaking to over the last 10 to 12 years were broadly 18 to 28, 30-ish. So now they're 28 to 38, 40 plus, and there's another group of teenagers and 20-somethings coming on stream. When I started this work 12 years ago, I heard constantly from Muslim modest dressers that they felt disregarded by the fashion industry. Fashion editors and stylists on the early Muslim lifestyle magazines in print, like Emel or Muslim Girl or Aziza, reported that fashion brands were often reluctant or unwilling to let them borrow garments for editorial fashion shoots. Now, sometimes this is because these magazines had a very small circulation, so the big brands aren't going to send out a Gucci dress or another brand, you're recording this, to a small circulation magazine. But it was also, they felt very clearly that the response was aversive, that they didn't want to be associated with something Muslim. So then, as my book, Modest Muslim Fashion, was about to come out, suddenly there was a flurry of interest from mainstream brands. 2014 saw the first foray into fashion from mainstream brands. This was DKNY, who marketed a Ramadan capsule collection in the Gulf, and it's modelled here by brand ambassador Tamara Al-Gabani, herself a Dubai-based designer and media celebrity. And this was followed in 2015 by Uniqlo's collaboration with British Muslim designer Hannah Tajima. Initially, that was only available in Southeast Asia. She did a second collection last summer, which was available in their flagship store in London in Oxford Street and in other parts of the UK. So we've seen things shift from the high-end luxury global brands in Southeast Asia and the Gulf to a range of brands across the sector now available in Europe and North America. The mainstream fashion industry that was aversive to being associated with Muslim consumers now sees them as an asset. How did this happen? What does it mean? I was more prescient than I knew. Now, to some extent, I think the industry started listening to the bloggers. And by bloggers, I mean all forms of social media. There's now a critical mass of social media visibilizing the diversity and liveliness of modest Muslim fashion. If you're a trend forecaster, you only have to walk down Oxford Street or the main high street in other British cities to see distinctive and varied trends. The other thing that brought the mainstream fashion industry to Muslims is that the professional marketing field has been pushing to have Muslims globally recognized as a consumer segment. This isn't surprising. Globally, Muslims are a youthful and growing population, often located in so-called emerging markets. Brands want your money. Brands want to form relationships with these young consumers to sell fridges and footwear. Now, initially, the professional marketing field in Islamic branding and Muslim marketing focused on food, halal certification schemes, and finance, Sharia-compliant mortgages, for example. And I kept saying fashion is going to be the third F. And sure enough, it did. Now, this is the MCB, the Muslim Council of Britain's report on the Muslim pound in 2013. So community organisations are also lobbying for this recognition. The global Muslim spend on all apparel, not just modest fashion, was valued at $224 billion US in 2012 and is projected to double, more than double, to 488 billion by 2019. In identifying Muslims as a previously underexploited market segment, brands and marketing professionals are not simply attending to an a priori social segment previously invisible. They are actively creating it, rendering religious dispositions into potential constituent parts of what Rose has termed the choosing subject of liberal capitalism. So part of my mission was to take modest fashion seriously as fashion. Modest fashion was from the start about more than merely fashion, though. It is self-evident that modest fashion designers and bloggers are important opinion formers as style tastemakers, sure. But they're also influencers about daily religious practice and the relationship of religion to state and society. And this is key to my follow-up research. Constituting a progressive, and we can talk about that difficult term later, element within often very conservative religious cultures, designers and bloggers can be hugely significant for their followers. And I've just put up a selection of stories from modest fashion blog sites to show to those of you who don't follow them the range of topics that routinely get covered, from politics to social affairs to sustainability and environmentalism. Now, young women, I think, are developing and disseminating new forms of religious practice. They're combining religious commitment and minority community participation with the quotidian trends of mainstream fashion. I don't think that we should disregard fashion developments as trivial. Of course I don't. Rather, I recommend that they be taken seriously as forms of religious knowledge creation and transmission that have the power to influence individual and collective understandings about the relationship of religious and religio-ethnic communities to society. Whilst most of the young and youngish women that I've spoken to in the course of my research would reject the idea that they are religious authorities, or even that they were engaging in forms of religious interpretation, many do accept that they are role models, taking seriously their responsibility to other, especially younger women. Modest fashion influencers operate on a transnational scale. Indonesian designer and blogger Dian Pelangi has 4.4 million followers on Instagram, probably more since I made that slide. Import duties make her products too expensive for her followers in Britain to buy, but her images travel globally. Visually led social media platforms minimize conventional language barriers. I think that emojis now function as a new form of transnational youth communication. And Dian came and gave a talk as part of International London Fashion Week when she was our LCF International Designer in Residence in 2015, and it was absolutely mobbed. Of course, she's a superstar. Modest fashion extends upwards. Young women tell me that their moms are now adapting their dress to wear hijab properly, as youth subculture embraces different age groups. You may have noticed women wearing saris with a separate piece of cloth being worn as a headscarf, as a hijab wrap, whilst the sari itself is a garment that has allowed women for many generations to present with the different degrees and flexible degrees of modesty that they have felt appropriate in different circumstances and contexts. So so-called ethnic fashion systems change constantly as well. As I've said, modest fashion influencers work across faiths. So this is modern Orthodox Jewish American blogger Nina Cohen, who guest posted on Elaine Hearn's Mormon blog, Clothed Much. And their influence also extends. Modest fashion influencers also negotiate intra and interfaith conflict. So Mimu Maxi, a New York Jewish Orthodox brand, did a collaboration with Sama Al-Bakr, who's a Muslim hijabi fashionista blogger. And this caused an enormous controversy because this was as tensions in Palestine were rising, and some of their Orthodox Jewish followers said, you shouldn't be doing this collaboration, you shouldn't be showing a Muslim woman on your site when our friends and family in Israel are in danger. And they really stood by their position and mounted an incredibly powerful, I thought, defense of why this is precisely the time when women should be talking to each other and engaging in constructive dialogue. And I'm happy to talk about that later if we have more time. Influence, therefore, redefined modesty. When blogger Winnie Detwa, the turban queen, decided to stop wearing hijab, her explanatory post reaffirmed her commitment to her young followers. And this is a really good example of Winnie, real name Nadia Azmi, taking seriously her obligations as a role model. It was a personal decision to stop wearing hijab. A number of her friends and colleagues said, you don't need to explain to anyone, it's up to you what you want to do, it's your choice. But she felt that she had a lot of young followers and that she wanted to give them an explanation. Now, she got terrible criticism onto her website about it. But at the same time, lots of people, not all of them Muslim, not all of them religiously identified, waded in to defend her against the online trolling as well. Modest fashion influence extends offline. You just mentioned the London Modest Fashion Week a couple of weeks ago. It's a growing sector. Fashion shows sometimes combine catwalk with community, providing motivational speakers, employment advice, and networking opportunities. Even shows that are straightforwardly commercial, like last month's London Modest Fashion Week, are hugely popular. Despite the ticket price, the show provided an opportunity for a special day out. There were loads of, did anyone go? All right, there were loads of teenagers on birthday treats. And it was seized upon also by wannabe young entrepreneurs in design and fashion mediation. It was also used as a research opportunity by lots of students, undergraduate, MA and PhD students, who were doing assignments on Muslim fashion, Muslim media and Muslim women. Now, I probably get 2, sometimes 3 emails a week asking for information from students around the country and abroad doing projects at all levels of HE and school about modest fashion and Muslim modest fashion. And I think it's really interesting that this is coming up as a research topic for students, and it's very interesting in terms of future careers. In a context where women wearing modest Muslim attire face obstacles in education and employment, modest fashion itself, as part of a niche industry, has in some instances provided routes to social and economic development for women. More broadly, for women not involved in the fashion industry, I'm waiting to see if and to what extent the interest in modest fashion from students and journalists will bring about potential changes in what is considered appropriate workwear, and I'm happy to talk about this later. So, will the pioneering cohort of modest fashion entrepreneurs and mediators carry on being influencers? Oh, Sarah Elanani, British designer, not in production at the moment, was commissioned to produce a design for the Scouts. Although my, at that point, 10-year-old nephew was horrified when I told him that girls could be Scouts too. I thought my cred was going to go sky high because my friend, the designer, is designing Scout news. Like, girls can't be Scouts. So, I think, yes, as they grow up through their young adulthood, these values and connections can travel with them into new roles in work, community, and family. Muslim women made prominent through fashion, or simply as hijabis, feel keenly a responsibility to represent their religious and ethnic communities, like 23-year-old Londoner Maria Idrissi, whose appearance in the H&M YouTube advert went viral immediately, and star baker Britain's darling Nadia Hussein. Modest fashion and Muslim women's dress is now rarely out of the news. Fashion stories about new Muslim hijab-wearing models, somebody taken on by AMG this season, are matched by the constant stream of legal attempts to control Muslim women's clothing. We know that discourses of choice are promoted as part of the logic of neoliberal consumer capitalism. But for me, this is not a reason to dismiss or disregard the use of choice in the assertion of veiling and modest fashion practices. Rather, I agree with Carla Jones' call to recognise the ambivalences within Islamic consumer practices. In this context, Muslim women's battles to define and defend their plural understanding of Muslim practice are waged as much and as constantly against the forces of conservatism within their religious communities as they are fought against religio-ethnic prejudice externally on the streets, at school, at work, or in the media. In the securitized post-9/11 context, I agree with Claire Alexander, who says, quote, "It may be possible to argue that as the colour line was for early 20th century, the Muslim question has become the defining issue of our times." That was 2013. Clothing and body management, veils and beards, now augment and sometimes replace skin colour as key signifiers of alterity. Mainstream politicians and media have a lot to say about Muslim women and how they look, where they go, what they do. Let's look for a moment at the controversy in summer 2016 over the ban on burkinis in some French beach resorts following the terrorist attack in Nice. As with previous national French attempts to control what Muslim women wear by banning headscarves at school or burqas on the street, this was generally more about French electioneering than a real concern for Muslim women's rights or freedoms. And yet, time and again, Muslims are put on the back foot, having to defend the rights of co-religionists to dress as they choose, even if they themselves don't consider a burqa or a burkini necessary or advisable. So I was really impressed with how this was articulated in a social media campaign launched in the United States. And remember, this was also during Trump's presidential campaign. And it was set up by 3 women's organizations with a track record in women's interfaith dialogue and activism. So under the hashtag, Our Choice Not Yours, they proclaimed, the recent events in France are truly a global women's issue. No government and no ideology has the right to impose on women's choices. These laws target a small minority, aiming to further marginalize all Muslims. We will not let history repeat itself by staying silent. We will come together to tell the world we are not going to take this. We will act with our mouth, arms and feet. We celebrate the French call overturning the burkini ban in one city. This is one small step. Yet we must not become complacent. A ban on any type of clothing takes away freedom. It is hateful to some of us, but impacts all of us. When one of us is hurt, we all hurt. That's why we're coming together in unity as women of faith to declare our commitment to freedom of choice. One of the things I talked about with Asma Udin of Alt Muslima is whether the need to be in response mode helps or hinders a diversity of Muslim opinion coming forward. To what extent is there a risk that the perceived need to defend all rights of religious expression may mean that Muslims come increasingly to be defined by the choices of the most orthodox? One could ask the same of other religions. So what's really interesting to me with this campaign, that the carefully nuanced statement links the need to defend women's choice against government controls to the need to see off controls from others who seek to regulate women's behaviour, in this case coded as male authorities. Have you all had a chance to read it? As with many commentators within modest fashion have made clear, religious groups seeking protection for religious rights must recognise and defend the rights of those with whom they disagree. This is an ongoing struggle for women in different faiths, women who don't wear the niqab defending those who do, and so on. So for me moving forward, I'm interested to track if the modest fashion commitment to respecting choice is coming under threat from religious groups that don't fully respect choices of others. I want to close with 2 examples about the changing signification of images and of practices in modest fashion and its representation. And I'm going to race through this. So I'm sure you've all seen this image. This image of a woman wearing the American flag as a headscarf, a hijab, was one of 3 images produced by American artist Shepard Fairey, and these could be downloaded for free and printed out. They were used by many who wanted to signal their opposition to politics proposed by President Trump, from attack on women's reproductive rights to the proposed ban on travel from 7 majority Muslim countries. So the image went viral. And his series of We the People, you can see in the top one, featured 3 different images, a young black man and a Latina woman, but it was the picture of the woman in hijab that became most prominent, used on the Women's March in Washington and many others. What's interesting is that he repurposed an image made some years previously after 9/11 by Muslim American photographer Ridwan Adami, a New York-based photographer from Queens. And his collaborator in creating the image, the woman in the photo, is Munira Ahmed, a Muslim American, also from Queens in New York, whose family emigrated to the United States from Bangladesh in the late 1970s. She does not herself wear the headscarf. She attended the march in Washington this year and spoke to the media about encountering women who presumed that she herself wore a hijab. And she spoke about this to The Guardian. Some of you may have seen this story that appeared elsewhere. She said, At the march in Washington, Ahmed said, quote, "One congresswoman came up to me and said she knew immediately that the woman in the picture was me. I was surprised because I seen people would think it was someone who covered with a hijab, and I actually don't. One group of girls asked me when I stopped covering, and I told them I never did." End quote. So the hijab was deployed by her and Adami over a decade ago, and the image, unfortunately, never lost its efficacy. The Guardian also reported that each time the question of Muslim patriotism was questioned, resurfaced, Adami, the photographer, said that he reposted the image of his friend wearing the hijab. With each turn, the picture became more deeply embedded, shared, and posted again. Late last year, he was approached by the Amplifier Foundation, and he said, this image has had so many different lives. So we have an image of a woman in a headscarf being used to tell a story about belonging, if not about patriotism, that makes Munira Ahmed immediately recognizable as a Muslim woman, whether she's wearing a scarf or not. But at the same time, we know that Muslim women who don't wear head covering are less visible to co-religionists and to external observers. So when we think about the politics of doing and disseminating research on difficult topics, I do think that if we're to get beyond essentializing stereotypes and combat prejudice, we must find ways to understand that how we present ourselves in the world and how we experience others is very likely to be marked by contradiction and change. This can make for challenging and creating creative conversations, and it's something that we need to think about in our role at work. I've got a few more points, but I'm going to stop there so that we have time for conversation.
I'm happy to let you finish if you want.
Okay, let's go. Dolce & Gabbana. Okay, next one. We'll stop there. One of the things we're doing, One of the things that I'm involved with at University Arts London is what we call a community of practice, which is a little pot of money to do something across the university. And we've got one on religion, belief, and faith identities in the learning and teaching environment at UAL. I need a snappier title. But really, it's thinking about, in terms of all forms of provision, how do we deal with the religion and belief part of the diversity legislation? And one of the reasons I'm doing this work is because I see in higher education, not only at my university, but amongst educators generally, a fear of getting it wrong when it comes to dealing with religion. I notice a cultural cringe about potentially offending someone's religious beliefs that parallels the anxieties about race and ethnicity with which many of us may be long familiar. And when I first was going around doing this talk to the different senior management teams at the colleges, I said, it's like there used to be. And somebody said to me, no, there still is the same the same anxiety about race and ethnicity. It's a parallel and different cringe about dealing with religion. And I think people often talk about we need to make sure that students are able to bring all parts of their heritage and their experience and their attitudes into the classroom. But they also don't think, well, this is also an issue for teachers, for educators, for staff in estates, for staff in all student-facing services. And particularly when we talk about prevent, it's not just our students who may be impacted by that, but our colleagues as well. So I think it's our responsibility as educators to foster an atmosphere of critical engagement based on mutual respect. There are no positions of moral purity, and the going can be tough, but it can be done. Status within the modest fashion community depends on spiritual and political integrity, as well as on style smarts. And as this research progresses, I'm going to be tracking if modest fashion activities create a stage for these young and youngish women to be recognised as influencers whose reach goes beyond style into politics, community, and employability. Modest fashion, as with Muslim fashion, may become an obsolete term in the market and in the media. The styles, familiar to me now, will certainly change. But I predict that practices relating the body to faith, to spirituality, to religious community, and to the market will continue, and will continue to provide a rich field for research. So I look forward to extending the conversation with you. Thank you.